Welcome back, football fans. Today we dive into something different. Why the Barcelona of 2026 is not just special, it's not normal.
Just to come in and contribute to a team that is already very good, the Liga champions, and we're scored more goals than any other side in European football. So I do believe that might be a good fit for both player and club.
Regalado a Robert Lewandowski. Es un espectáculo de 17 años. Tiene más salidas que el metro de...
This isn't another highlight reel. This is a story of collapse, chaos, and the unthinkable rebirth of a fallen giant. Stay with us as we go inside the storm. Here's the truth. Before 2026, Barcelona wasn't feared. They were broken. The club that once terrified Europe was on its knees, bleeding money, drowning in scandals, and carrying the ghosts of Messi's departure like a wound that refused to heal. Remember the headlines? Endless talk of financial ruin. Players leaving because salaries couldn't be paid. The stadium that once shook under Champions League nights now echoed with disappointment. Fans weren't celebrating. They were bracing for the next disaster. For years, Barcelona wasn't the story of hope. It was the story of failure, bitter exits in Europe, humiliations at the hands of rivals, and a generation of supporters asking the same question: how did the mighty fall this far? This wasn't just a team losing games, it was an identity crisis. A club that once stood for football's poetry was now a tragic headline, and behind closed doors, whispers began. Maybe Barcelona would never come back. Maybe the dynasty was gone for good. But here's the catch. Sometimes the darkest nights create the fiercest dawns. What looked like an ending was only a beginning, and what started in those broken years would set the stage for the most unnatural Barcelona we've ever seen. The storm was brutal, but it wasn't the real story. The real story began with what came after. There was a time when Barcelona didn't just win, they crushed spirits. Teams stepped onto the pitch already defeated, knowing the ball would belong to Barca and the game would feel like chasing shadows. But by the mid-2020s, that fear was gone. Completely gone. Clubs that once parked the bus now attacked without hesitation. Underdogs walked into the Camp Nou and left with points. Europe's elite no longer worried about Barcelona in the Champions League draw. They wanted them. Facing Barca was no longer a nightmare, it was an opportunity. And here's the painful part. Barcelona fans could feel it too. The aura, the magic, the intimidation, it had slipped away. Watching their team wasn't just frustrating, it was heartbreaking. Every match was a reminder that the dynasty was over. Think about it. From the days of Messi, Xavi, Iniesta, and Busquets, a dynasty that seemed immortal, to headlines of early exits, mid-table struggles, and financial disasters. The shift wasn't slow. It was brutal. The giant didn't just stumble, it collapsed. And as if the defeats weren't enough, the ridicule came. Rivals mocked, pundits dissected. Barcelona, once the model of how to run a club, had become the warning sign. Once the teacher, now the example of what not to do. The world stopped fearing Barcelona. That was the reality. But here's the twist. When the fear was gone, when the reputation was dead, something else began to grow. Something dangerous, something nobody saw coming. Because when a giant has nothing left to lose, that's when they start building differently. In the chaos of those broken years, while the world laughed at Barcelona's fall, something quiet was happening. Not in the headlines, not on the pitch. Deep inside the club, behind the noise of debt figures and failed transfers, a different conversation was taking place. Whispers of rebuilding, not with overpriced superstars, not with desperation buys, but with a new vision. One that sounded almost impossible. Here's the thing, nobody believed it. How could they? A club drowning financially talking about long-term projects and future dynasties. It sounded like survival PR, not a plan. Pundits mocked, rival fans shrugged, even some supporters rolled their eyes, but the seeds were being planted. In La Masia, the academy that once gave the world Messi, Xavi, Iniesta, a new generation was being shaped in silence. The philosophy wasn't dead, it was being rewritten, modernized, hardened. It wasn't just about developing talent, it was about creating warriors with technique. Players who didn't just fit the Barca style, but who could survive the brutal, fast, physical modern game. Football was changing, and Barcelona wasn't planning to catch up. They were planning to redefine it. Still, from the outside, it looked like fantasy. Broken finances, crumbling results, and a fan base losing faith. Nobody thought those whispers mattered, but sometimes the most dangerous revolutions don't begin with noise, they begin with silence. And soon, that silence would start producing names. Names the world would pretend not to notice at first, but names that would eventually shake the game to its core. The seeds were buried deep in the dirt of failure, but in 2026, they would break the surface. And when they did, football would never look at Barcelona the same way again. For years, the talk was about who Barcelona lost. Messi gone, Neymar gone, legends fading, superstars slipping through their fingers. But in 2026, the conversation flipped. Suddenly, it wasn't about departures, it was about arrivals, and not the kind anyone predicted. These weren't big money transfers brought in with glittering presentations. These were kids. Names that sounded ordinary at first, but with touches that were anything but ordinary. From Masia, the pipeline began to flow again. Midfielders with vision far beyond their years. Forwards who carried the arrogance of youth and the hunger of the streets. Defenders who didn't just play safe, they played with fire in their veins. But it wasn't just talent, it was chemistry. These youngsters weren't polished products, they were raw, fearless, unshaken by history. While critics said Barcelona had no future, these players were quietly writing it. The world barely noticed at first. A debut here, a spark there, a goal that felt lucky, an assist that looked like a fluke. But soon, the patterns emerged. These weren't accidents. These kids were different. They played without the weight of fear. And then, something even more shocking. Fans who had been disillusioned for years started to believe again. Not because of trophies, not because of big signings, but because of the feeling. The feeling that Barcelona's heartbeat was returning. Here's the twist though. This wasn't nostalgia. This wasn't Messi 2.0 or Iniesta reborn. This generation wasn't about looking back. It was about breaking the mold. They weren't copies of the past. They were the architects of something new. The new blood had arrived, and with every touch, every run, every fearless shot, they carried a message. The world may have stopped fearing Barcelona, but it was about to start again. But who allowed this new era to take shape? Who protected it when the pressure to chase superstars was suffocating? The answer wasn't on the pitch, it was in the shadows. The spotlight always shines on the players. The goals, the assists, the celebrations, that's what fans see. But Barcelona's 2026 didn't start with magic on the pitch. It started in the shadows with a handful of people who refused to let the club die. Think about the pressure, debt climbing into billions, fans demanding superstars, the media laughing at every mistake. Every logical decision said, sell, survive, forget the dream. But the silent architects inside the club didn't listen. They chose a harder path. Instead of chasing a quick fix, they doubled down on identity. They rebuilt scouting networks, restructured La Masia, and shielded young players from the chaos. While others wanted instant trophies, these architects fought in years, not weeks. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't celebrated. In fact, most of the time, it was criticized. Where are the signings? Where's the progress? Why are they trusting kids? The world didn't understand. And maybe that was the point. They were playing the long game, investing in development instead of debt, choosing patience over panic. And when the first sparks of talent began to shine, they protected them, carefully, ruthlessly. Not every academy rebuild survives the weight of expectation, but this one did because it had guardians who knew exactly when to expose and when to hide. And here's the thing, without these silent architects, there is no 2026 Barcelona. No fearless kids, no rebirth, no not normal team. They built the shield, they designed the stage, they turned failure into fuel. But all of this work, all of this preparation would mean nothing without a single moment. The moment the world realized Barcelona was no longer a shadow of its past, but a storm rising again. That moment was about to come, and when it did, football stopped to watch. Every rebirth has a moment, one night, one match when whispers turn into roars and doubt turns into belief. For Barcelona, that moment didn't come in a final, or even with a trophy. It came in a game nobody expected to matter as much as it did. It was tense, the kind of night where the air feels heavier, where every mistake could confirm the critics' prophecy that Barcelona was finished. The stands were restless, the cameras unforgiving, the opponents hungry, and then it happened. Not with a superstar, not with an old veteran carrying the team on his back. No, it was one of the new blood, a name the world barely knew. A kid who should have been nervous but played like he'd been waiting his whole life for this stage. Every touch carried defiance, every sprint screamed, "We're not done." And then, the moment, one strike, one finish, one eruption that shook the Camp Nou back to life. The crowd didn't just cheer, they believed. It wasn't about the scoreline. It wasn't even about the win. It was about the message. Barcelona was no longer a team to pity. They were dangerous again. Pundits who laughed months before suddenly shifted tone. Maybe something's happening here. Rivals who once saw Barcelona as easy prey started circling with caution again. The fear hadn't returned fully, but the seed of it was back. That night wasn't just a victory, it was a signal. The game that announced Barcelona's 2026 wasn't a rebuild, it was a revolution. But revolutions aren't clean. For every rise, there's resistance. For every high, there's a setback waiting. And Barcelona's journey was about to meet its price. Success stories often get told like fairy tales. A rise, a breakthrough, and then trophies. But Barcelona's 2026 wasn't built on smooth victories. It was built on blood, setbacks, and the kind of sacrifices most people never see. Young players don't grow in straight lines. For every dazzling debut, there were nights of failure, mistakes under the spotlight, costly errors that drew headlines and criticism. And when you're Barcelona, there's no hiding. Every misstep is magnified. Every stumble feels like the end of the world. There were injuries too, careers threatened before they even began. Players who looked like future stars suddenly sidelined for months, fighting not just opponents, but their own bodies. For a young squad, these blows hit harder. They didn't just test ability, they tested character. And then came the pressure. Fans demanding miracles, media picking apart every decision, rivals circling like sharks, waiting to pounce on signs of weakness. This wasn't a safe environment for growth, it was a furnace, and not everyone survived it. But here's the paradox. Those struggles were the sharpening stone. The pain forged something different in this team. They weren't protected stars wrapped in comfort. They were hardened fighters. Each setback turned into fuel. Each sacrifice carved away softness and left only steel. Barcelona 2026 didn't become not normal by avoiding failure. They became not normal because they endured it and kept coming back sharper, hungrier, more ruthless. Still, even with all that resilience, the world wasn't ready for what came next, because this wasn't just about football anymore. What Barcelona was building started to ripple far beyond the pitch. By 2026, something strange was happening. Barcelona wasn't just winning matches, they were changing conversations. This wasn't football as usual. This was something else, something bigger. Every generation of Barcelona has carried an identity. The Cruyff Revolution, the Guardiola dynasty, Messi's era of magic. But the 2026 team, they didn't fit into any old box. They weren't Tiki-Taka 2.0, and they weren't a nostalgia project. They were raw, fearless, unpredictable. A cultural shock to the football world. Fans across Europe started noticing. Neutral supporters, who once tuned in just to watch Messi, now found themselves glued again. Not because of one superstar, but because of the feeling, the chaos, the energy, the sense that anything could happen when Barcelona took the pitch. And inside the Camp Nou, the transformation was even more powerful. After years of empty seats, financial gloom, and half-hearted support, the stadium was alive again. You could feel it, the belief, the intimidation, the pride. Barcelona was no longer a team weighed down by its past. It was a movement pulling people forward. Even rivals admitted it. Something about this Barcelona felt unsettling. They didn't play like the polished, predictable giant of old. They played like a pack of wolves, young, hungry, relentless. It wasn't just football, it was rebellion in motion. And here's the real shock. This identity wasn't tied to one man. No Messi, no Ronaldinho, no single savior. It was collective, a culture of defiance. That's why it felt unstoppable. Because it wasn't about replacing legends, it was about rewriting what a legend even meant. But cultural shocks don't stay contained, they spread. And soon, what Barcelona was doing in 2026 started shifting the entire balance of European football. Here's the thing about revolutions. They don't stay local. By 2026, Barcelona's rise wasn't just their story anymore. It was a shockwave rolling across European football, forcing everyone else to react. Clubs that once laughed at Barcelona's youth project suddenly scrambled to copy it. Academies across Europe felt the pressure. If Barca could rise again without billion-dollar transfers, what excuse did anyone else have? Suddenly, raw talent mattered again. Development mattered again. The transfer market started shifting too. Instead of endless spending wars for aging stars, teams began scouting differently, searching for teenagers with fire in their eyes, not just polished superstars with brand deals. Barcelona had made youth cool again, and dangerous. Even tactics changed. Coaches who once designed game plans to exploit Barcelona's weaknesses now had to rethink everything. Barca wasn't slow, predictable, or fragile anymore. They were fast, aggressive, fearless. Their unpredictability forced rivals to adapt, to innovate, just to survive against them. And maybe the most important domino? Belief. Other fallen giants, clubs buried in debt, mocked in the media, written off as relics, looked at Barcelona and thought, if they can do it, why can't we? Barcelona 2026 didn't just rebuild themselves, they reshaped the landscape. They proved that football's future doesn't belong to whoever spends the most, but to whoever dares to think differently. But here's the question that hung over all of it. Was this rebirth permanent? Or was it just a flash? A wild season that would fade into memory? That's what made 2026 so unsettling, because nobody knew if this was a new dynasty or just an illusion. And that's where the story takes us next. By the end of 2026, the debate was everywhere. Was Barcelona back? Or had they become something entirely new? For some, this was the rebirth of the old dynasty, proof that La Masia, the philosophy, the culture of Barca could never truly die. They saw echoes of the past, the youth, the courage, the artistry. To them, 2026 was history repeating itself, but others didn't agree. They argued this wasn't Barcelona reborn, it was Barcelona reinvented. A version unchanged from the nostalgia of tiki-taka and Messi. A version shaped by failure, sharpened by struggle, and fueled by raw, unfiltered hunger. This wasn't a copy of greatness, it was a mutation of it. And maybe that's why 2026 Barcelona felt so not normal. They weren't supposed to rise this fast. They weren't supposed to shake European football without megastar signings. They weren't supposed to turn humiliation into power. But they did. The truth, legacy, or illusion, it didn't matter in that moment. What mattered was the feeling. The fear returning to rivals, the pride flooding back into fans, the sense that Barcelona had once again bent football to their will. 2026 wasn't just about results. It was about rewriting what was possible when a broken giant refuses to stay down. And that's why this Barcelona will always feel different. Because they didn't just win games, they forced us to question what normal even means in football. So here's the question for you. Was 2026 Barcelona the start of a new empire? Or was it a once-in-a-lifetime miracle that will never be repeated? So here we are, Barcelona 2026. More than a team, more than a season. A story that started in ruins and ended in rebirth. A reminder that even when a giant falls, it can rise again. Different, sharper, maybe even scarier. And that's what makes this version of Barcelona not normal. They weren't carried by one legend. They weren't saved by billion-dollar transfers. They were built in silence, tested by fire, and unleashed with hunger the world wasn't ready for. But the bigger question lingers. What comes next? Does this Barcelona define the next decade of football, or will it be remembered as a wild spark that lit the night but burned out too fast? I want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Was 2026 the beginning of a new empire, or just the most unforgettable chapter in Barca's history? And if you enjoyed diving deep into this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and make sure you don't miss the next breakdown, because trust me, football always has another twist coming.